On the morning of April 14, 1865, the city of Washington, D.C. was a simulation of pure relief. For 4 years, the American experiment had been suspended in a state of catastrophic system failure. The Civil War was not just a conflict of armies, it was a fundamental clash between two incompatible social operating systems. Over 600,000 lives had been deleted from the national census. The infrastructure of the South was in ruins. But in that second week of April, the data suggested that the war was over. General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The system error that had threatened to tear the Union apart was finally being corrected. At the center of this correction was a man who had become the ultimate architect of the Union's survival, Abraham Lincoln. To his supporters, he was the master programmer who had successfully navigated the most complex crisis in human history. To his detractors, he was a tyrant who had overstepped the bounds of the original American code. Lincoln himself felt the weight of the years. His face, etched with deep lines of exhaustion, was a living record of the national trauma. But on this Good Friday, he felt a rare sense of peace. He believed the hard work of Reconstruction, the recoding of the American soul, could finally begin. However, in the shadows of the Capitol, a different protocol was being prepared. History is often redirected not by the movement of armies, but by the actions of a single radicalized anomaly. John Wilkes Booth was a man of fame, an actor who understood the power of the spectacle. He didn't see Lincoln as a hero, he saw him as a glitch that needed to be removed to save a lost cause. Booth wasn't working alone. He was the lead element in a coordinated attempt to decapitate the entire United States government in a single night. The context: the War of Incompatible Codes. To understand the erasure of Lincoln, we must first analyze the environment of 1861 to 1865. The American Civil War was the most significant system crash in the history of the Republic. The nation was operating on a constitution that contained a fundamental logic bomb, the issue of slavery. For decades, political leaders had used patches and compromises to keep the system running, but by 1860, the friction had become absolute. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, the Southern states viewed his arrival as a terminal threat to their economic and social hardware. They chose to disconnect from the Union, creating their own rival simulation, the Confederacy. Lincoln's entire presidency was defined by one goal: the preservation of the Union. He viewed the United States as a singular, indivisible machine. To allow the South to leave was to admit that the American experiment had failed. The war that followed was a high-intensity conflict that pushed the limits of 19th-century technology and human endurance. It was the first industrial war. Lincoln, operating from the telegraph office of the War Department, functioned like a data processor. He monitored the movement of troops, the flow of supplies, and the shifts in public opinion with clinical precision. He was forced to make decisions that resulted in staggering losses of life, all to maintain the integrity of the national code. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate system was in total collapse. Its currency was worthless, its armies were dissolving, and its capital, Richmond, had been captured. Lincoln had visited the ruins of Richmond just days before his departure, sitting in the chair of the Confederate president. The war was won, but the Reconstruction phase was the most dangerous part of the process. Lincoln wanted a lenient update, a way to bring the Southern states back into the system without permanent hostility. This moderate approach, however, created friction with radicals in his own party and sparked a violent, desperate reaction from those who refused to accept the new reality. Part 2. The Catalyst. The radicalization of the anomaly. The catalyst for the systemic interruption was not a soldier, but a performer. John Wilkes Booth was one of the most famous actors in America, a man of privilege, beauty, and immense talent. But beneath the celebrity facade, Booth was a fervent supporter of the Southern system. He viewed the end of slavery and the rise of Lincoln as an existential error that destroyed the world he loved. Booth's radicalization followed a specific escalation path. Originally, he didn't intend to erase Lincoln. In late 1864, he organized a group of conspirators with the goal of kidnapping the president. The plan was to hold Lincoln hostage in exchange for Confederate prisoners of war, a strategic move to reboot the Southern war effort. They even went so far as to wait on a deserted road for Lincoln's carriage, but the president changed his plans at the last minute. The glitch was avoided for a time. The catalyst shifted from capture to erasure on April 11, 1865. Lincoln gave a speech from a White House window discussing the future of the nation and suggesting that certain formerly enslaved people should be given the right to vote. Booth was in the audience. Witnesses noted his physical reaction of rage. To Booth, this was the final line. The architect was no longer just a political rival. He was a threat to the racial and social hierarchy that Booth believed was natural. Booth realized that the traditional war was over, but he believed he could initiate a systemic reset by removing the top layer of the government. On the morning of April 14th, while picking up his mail at Ford's Theater, he learned that the president would be attending a performance of Our American Cousin that very night. The opportunity had manifested. Booth activated his cell of conspirators, assigning targets for the vice president and the secretary of state. The objective was total decapitation of the American leadership. The anomaly was now in motion, and the system's defense protocols were about to be tested. Part 3. The escalation. The vulnerability of the guard. In the hours leading up to the 10:15 p.m. glitch, the American Capitol was operating under a dangerous illusion of security. The psychological software of the Union's leadership was set to a state of victory. They believed the primary threats were external, armies in the field and warships in the harbors. They failed to account for the internal anomaly that had already permeated the city's social fabric. John Wilkes Booth was not a stranger to the halls of power or the venues of the elite. His status as a famed actor granted him a user access that few others possessed. On the afternoon of April 14, while the president was enjoying a carriage ride with his wife, Mary, discussing their future after the presidency, Booth was finalizing the Erasure Protocol. He met with his co-conspirators at Mary Surratt's boarding house, assigning roles with the cold precision of a director. Lewis Powell, a hulking and violent veteran, was tasked with the deletion of Secretary of State William Seward. George Atzerodt, a carriage painter with a nervous disposition, was ordered to eliminate Vice President Andrew Johnson. David Harold was to act as the navigator for their escape. This was designed to be a systemic decapitation. If successful, the executive branch would be erased in a single hour, leaving the Union leaderless and potentially triggering a reboot of the Civil War. While the conspirators prepared, the president's own security protocols were encountering a fatal error. The man assigned to guard the president's box at Ford's Theater was John Frederick Parker. Parker was a glitch in human form. At the start of the play, Parker was stationed outside the door to the state box. However, during the intermission, he committed a catastrophic breach of protocol. He left his post. Some records suggest he went to a nearby tavern for a drink, the same tavern where John Wilkes Booth was seen moments later stealing his nerves with whiskey. The president's box was now an unprotected node. The door to the box had a small hole bored into it, likely by Booth earlier that day, allowing the assassin to monitor the data inside without being seen. The theater was packed, the laughter was loud, and the atmospheric tension of the play, Our American Cousin, provided the perfect white noise to mask the approach of the anomaly. Booth entered the theater through the front door, walked up the stairs, and moved through the shadows of the balcony. He was a familiar face to the staff. No one questioned his presence. He was moving through the system unchallenged, a virus that had already bypassed the firewall. Part 4. The climax. the intersection of performance and tragedy. At approximately 10:25 p.m., the simulation and the reality collided. Booth waited for the precise moment in the play when the audience would be at its loudest, a specific line delivered by the actor Harry Hawk. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dalizing old man trap." Booth knew this line would trigger a roar of laughter. Under the cover of that acoustic surge, he entered the vestibule of the president's box. He wedged a piece of wood against the outer door to prevent anyone from entering behind him. He then stepped into the box itself. Lincoln sat in a red silk rocking chair, his eyes fixed on the stage. To his right was Mary. To his left were their guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Booth drew a .44 caliber single-shot Philadelphia Derringer, a small concealable weapon designed for a single terminal task. He stepped forward and fired at point-blank range. The lead ball entered behind Lincoln's left ear, tunneling through the brain matter and coming to rest behind the right eye. The sound was muffled by the laughter of the crowd, but for those inside the box, the glitch was instantaneous. A cloud of black powder smoke filled the small space. Major Rathbone lunged at Booth, but the assassin dropped the pistol and drew a large hunting knife, slashing Rathbone's arm to the bone. Booth then climbed onto the railing of the box. His spur caught on the decorative Treasury Guard flag draped over the front, a physical error in his escape. He fell nearly 12 feet to the stage, his left fibula snapping upon impact. To the audience, the figure appearing from the smoke seemed like a part of the performance, but the scream that followed was not in the script. Booth stood, brandished his knife, and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He limped across the stage, disappeared into the wings, and mounted a horse waiting in the alley. Inside the box, the system failure was total. Lincoln's head had dropped forward, his breathing labored. Mary Lincoln's screams alerted the crowd that this was not a play. A young doctor, Charles Leal, fought his way into the box. He found the president paralyzed, his pupils dilated. He cleared a blood clot from the wound, momentarily restoring a rhythmic breath, but he looked at the guests and delivered the clinical reality. His wound is mortal. It is impossible for him to recover. The architect had been erased. The only task left was to document the end. Part 5. The Aftermath. The 7:22 a.m. Reset. The transition of Abraham Lincoln from a living leader to a historical monument took place over 9 agonizing hours in a small back room across the street from the theater. The president was carried into the Peterson House, a modest boarding home. Because he was too tall for the bed, he was laid diagonally, his body a literal glitch in the cramped geometry of the room. As the night progressed, the Peterson House became the temporary command center of the American government. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took charge with a cold administrative efficiency. He began issuing orders for the arrest of the conspirators, the guarding of the city, and the documentation of testimony. While the doctors struggled to maintain a pulse, Stanton was already preparing for the system reboot. Outside, the city of Washington was in a state of chaotic entropy. Rumors swirled that the entire cabinet had been deleted. News arrived that Secretary Seward had been brutally stabbed in his bed, though he survived the protocol. Vice President Johnson was found safe, though his intended assassin had lost his nerve and spent the night drinking instead. The coordinated erasure had partially failed, but the primary target was beyond saving. As the sun began to rise on April 15th, the president's breathing became shallower. The rhythmic gasps that had filled the room grew quiet. At 7:22 a.m., the heart of the 16th president stopped. Edwin Stanton, looking at the stillness, uttered the phrase that would define the legacy of the event. "Now he belongs to the ages." The manhunt that followed was one of the most intense in history.
For 12 days, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold navigated the swamps of Maryland and Virginia, a fragmented file trying to escape the national search. On April 26th, federal troops cornered them in a tobacco barn. When Booth refused to surrender, the barn was set on fire. A sergeant named Boston Corbett, acting against orders, fired through a gap in the boards, striking Booth in the neck. The anomaly was neutralized. As Booth lay dying on the porch of the farmhouse, he looked at his hands and whispered his final words, "Useless, useless." The deletion was complete, but the result was not the reset he had envisioned.
Part 6. The Legacy, the Eternal Variable. The erasure of Abraham Lincoln did not result in the systemic reset that John Wilkes Booth had envisioned. Instead, it triggered a data corruption in the American Reconstruction that would last for over a century. In the clinical language of history, the removal of the architect at the moment of the system update meant that the transition from a slave-holding society to a modern democracy was left without its primary navigator. Without Lincoln's influence, the Reconstruction period became a series of fragmented and conflicting protocols. His successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked the political software to manage the radical Republicans in Congress or the defiant remnants of the Southern aristocracy. The result was a century of systemic errors, the rise of Jim Crow laws, the disenfranchisement of millions, and a social friction that continues to trigger glitches in the American simulation to this day. However, the act of deletion also served to hard-code Lincoln into the national identity. By departing at the moment of his greatest victory, on a day already loaded with religious symbolism, Lincoln was transformed from a mortal politician into an eternal variable. He became the sacred archetype of the American Union. His life was archived not just in history books, but in the marble of the Lincoln Memorial, a silent, seated giant watching over the city where his simulation was interrupted. Ford's Theater, once a place of entertainment, remains a preserved glitch site. The president's box is kept exactly as it was on that April night, a frozen frame in a 19th century tragedy. It serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of the system. It shows that no matter how advanced the code or how strong the firewall, the entire direction of a civilization can be altered by a single determined anomaly with a point-blank trajectory.